Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of DeBunked Files. I'm happy today to have my co-host with me, Mr. Bub Coons. Hey Bub, how's it going?
Hey Candace, how are you?
All the way from sunny California, and we're about to have a snowstorm, so, good to see you.
You guys are? Oh, great. I think it's 72 out here, so I'll be thinking of you. Yeah, but you got the cool neon thing,
I do. Everyone
the
wants
almost
to
real
everyone
debunked
wants to
thing.
mention the neon.
I like it a lot. That's good. I need something like that around, a necklace or something on my knuckles. Debunked
Or
Files.
just a gold chain. Maybe a gold chain
Yes,
with
that'll work.
Debunked Files.
That'll work.
That would be good.
I'm
That's
about
the
that
cool
age
thing.
now where you got to get a gold chain, I think. Yeah.
Well, on our show, but before we start our show, I just want to say one thing. We have a Grand Canyon expedition trip coming up in October, and it's an opportunity that if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, if you want sort of a biblical perspective and being able to just see many of the great locations of the canyon, then we'd love for you to join this expedition. But, Bub, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest for today, and then we'll go ahead and start interviewing.
I'll introduce him in a very unique way. Bill is a historian. He's also a Christian. You can reverse those. He's a Christian first, but he's also a historian and a great writer. But you know what? The best thing that I think about when I think of Bill is he brings history to life like no one else I've ever seen. It's like his mind knows every little tributary in history, and he can connect all of it together and then bring all the insightful stuff and make it matter and make it seem so important, which it is. But so many other types of people. And look, I grew up with a lot of history teachers, and I fell asleep in the classes. This is not one of those guys. I wish he was my teacher when I was younger because I would have known a lot more about history. But for no further ado here, Mr. William Federer, welcome to the DeBunked Files. Thanks for being here.
Bob, great to be with you.
Bill, you just came out with a book about Booker T. Washington, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today because that's what we entitled this episode, Courageous Men Matter. But before we do that, we thought we'd take our mic'd up team and go out on the street and ask some of the people on the street if they even knew who Booker T. Washington was. My oldest daughter, she's a junior in high school. She said she just learned about him in her U.S. history class. But let's see, before we start talking to you, what people on the street really know about him.
Have you guys ever heard of Booker T. Washington?
Yes.
You have?
Yeah.
Okay, what can you tell me about Booker T. Washington?
He started schools for black people in Georgia and Alabama, and they were like BOSI schools. So
Like bougie, like
no, BOSI schools.
BOSI. What is a BOSI?
It's
I thought you meant bougie,
It's a
like.
trade school.
a trade school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And he also did a lot of experimentation with peanuts, correct?
Yeah. Have you guys ever heard of Booker T. Washington?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you know about Booker T. Washington? You answered first.
He was black.
Ding, 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 ding. Okay.
Thing with education. He was, I don't know. We compared him to somebody in class in high school, I think.
All right, that was pretty. Now you answered second. What do you?
I don't know anything. I just took A push and didn't really study. The name sounds familiar.
You didn't study at all?
No.
Did you pass?
Yeah.
Our education system is perfect, isn't it? With an A? Oh, that's hilarious. All right, thank you.
Civil rights people from high school.
Does he have hair like your beard?
I don't think it was this glorious, but I think he may have had. So wait, repeat what you said though.
Civil rights person from high school is when that name rings a bell for me.
Okay, awesome.
We're learning about him in history right now.
No way. Well, it is Black History Month, so what have you learned so far?
He did the Atlanta something speech, compromise speech or something. Yeah.
Hey, can I ask you guys a question? Have you ever heard of Booker T. Washington?
Yes.
What do you know about Booker T. Washington?
He was in history class.
He was.
He was an African American activist, right?
Yeah. What do you know?
Just as much as her.
As much as her?
Yeah.
That was a good answer though. He was in history class. No, that is true though. Thank you guys. You're awesome.
All right. So, Bill, were they right? Were they close? What should people know about Booker T. Washington?
It was George Washington Carver that did the experimentation with the peanuts, but George Washington Carver did teach at Tuskegee Institute with Booker T. So Booker T. Washington was born in 1856, right before the end of slavery. And so he grew up on a plantation. He talks about having to make grass skirts, and they itched terrible. And then he would go out there and pick the cotton and carry it and so forth. And he remembers his mom telling, matter of fact, in my book that I wrote on Booker T, I quote from Booker T. Washington's own book, The Story of My Life. And he said, I was asked not long ago to tell something about his past. And he says, from the time I can remember anything, almost every day of my life has been occupied with some kind of labor. During the period I spent in slavery, I was not large enough to be of much service. I still was occupied most of the time in cleaning the yards, carrying water to the men in the fields, and going to the mill, to which I used to take corn once a week to be ground. And so at the time you had Abraham Lincoln debating Stephen Douglas over the issue of slavery. And so was a Republican, and the Democrats in the South had slavery. Democrat Senator from Mississippi was Jefferson Davis, later went on to become the president of the Confederacy. But Jefferson Davis said African slavery as it exists in the United States is a moral, a social, and a political blessing. So it shows you the difference, Democrats and Republicans at the time.
Yeah.
So Lincoln, 2 weeks after the Dred Scott case, Lincoln said, 2 weeks ago, Judge Douglas spoke here on the Dred Scott decision. He finds the Republicans insisting that the Declaration of Independence includes all men, black as well as white. He boldly denies that it includes Negroes. I protest that. Chief Justice Roger Taney, in his opinion, Dred Scott admits the language of the Declaration is broad enough to include the whole human race, but he and Judge Douglas argue that the authors of that instrument did not intend to include Negroes. I think the authors of that noble instrument intended to include all men. Dred Scott, his wife, and 2 daughters were all involved in that suit. Judge Douglas is delightful to have them decided to be slaves. Anyway, Lincoln goes on to elaborate on the differences between the two parties. And so this is going on when Booker T. Washington is just a young boy.
Yeah.
And so he writes, so far as I can recall, the first knowledge I had that we were slaves and that there was freedom to the slaves was early one morning before the day when I was awakened by my mother kneeling over her children and fervently praying that Lincoln and his armies might be successful and that one day she and her children might be free. Have a major turning point in the Civil War, a battle of Antietam, and then General Lee is driven back, and Lincoln said, I made a solemn promise before God that if General Lee were driven back from Pennsylvania, I would crown the result with declaring freedom to the slaves. And then, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation. So when Booker T was 9 years old, the war ended, and he wrote, says there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. Most of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. Some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long piece of paper, the Emancipation Proclamation. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children. While tears of joy ran down her cheeks, she explained to us what it all meant, that this day was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never see it.
Bill, can I ask you a question? And you kind of touched on it a little bit in that first part, but what changed? Because you do have, and I don't like to be too political, but you had this Democratic Party that was basically pro-slave, and yet now in our society we have, the majority of the Democratic Party has the black vote. So what changed from then until now?
Oh, that's a really good question. So in my book, I track it. After the war, Ulysses S. Grant left the federal troops in the South. Ulysses S. Grant was Republican, and he started the Department of Justice to stop the Democrat vigilante groups. The KKK. So there were 13,000 pages of documents of the Democrats doing lynchings and intimidating people. And so in 1871, the Republican Congress pushed through the Ku Klux Klan Act. And then you had the end of Reconstruction, which the federal troops were pulled out of the South. And that's when the Democrats pushed through the Jim Crow laws and black codes and Tuskegee Institute, which Booker T. Washington founded. They did research in the 1960s, and they documented over 4,400 documented lynchings. 1,200 of those lynchings were white Republicans down in the South registering to freed slaves to vote. And so the Republicans were called by the Democrats the extremist party or the radical party. And so they would call them the radicals. But here, about a quarter of the lynchings were these white Republicans down in the South. So it wasn't a black-white issue, it was a Democrat-Republican issue. And so they had Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, had the first black man in the White House for dinner. It was Booker T. Washington. And the Memphis Scimitar newspaper slams Teddy Roosevelt, saying if he'd have had dinner with a porter in the train car, that'd be okay, but he defiled the White House. And so then you had Democrat President Woodrow Wilson, and he shows a KKK film in the White House, and he segregates all the federal offices. And then you had Eisenhower integrate. He was a Republican. He integrated the military. You had Democrat Governor George Wallace in the 1960s, governor of Alabama, standing in front of a school saying segregation now, segregation forever. And then the hosing down of black people on the streets and sicking dogs on them by the Democrat Commissioner Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. But now we have television, and the television is showing all this. And so Lyndon Johnson does the big switch from intimidation to entitlement. So instead of intimidating the minority voters, he created the Great Society welfare state. And the idea is to get as many minorities to sign up for welfare as possible, and then they'll be continual voters for the party that gives them the welfare. And so two motivations in human nature, a positive and negative, right? So it's in private or the lead, as in Chicago, they would say. And so Lyndon Johnson changed from manipulating through intimidation tactics to manipulating through welfare tactics. But you had the Republicans pushing through civil rights legislation. And even Martin Luther King Jr., in his famous I Have a Dream speech, he condemns Governor George Wallace. He says, even in Alabama, with its governor's lips dripping with racism, even there, right, because he's a Democrat governor, he says, someday the sons of slave owners will be friends with the sons of slaves, and I'm paraphrasing. So that's was the big switch. So it switched from intimidation to the welfare program.
I'm just curious, like what strikes my curiosity is, you've written so many books and so many great books. Like, why did you choose to write this book right now? I know you didn't write it right now, but when you started it, and what is the main thing that we can learn from Booker T's experience in his life?
So my mom grew up in Neosho, Missouri. And so every summer as kids, we would go down to Neosho, and that's where George Washington Carver has his museum. It was the first birthplace made into a national memorial other than a U.S. president. And it was the Senator Harry S. Truman from Missouri, before he became president. Harry S. Truman pushed through to recognize George Washington Carver's birthplace. And so as a child, we would go there. And the first book I can remember reading was the gift from my grandparents was on George Washington Carver. And so he was born a slave, walked 8 miles from Diamond Grove, Missouri into Neosho, Missouri, where my grandparents were. And then he went to a little school, then he went to Kansas, and then he gets a letter, he goes to Iowa State College of Agriculture, and he gets a letter from Booker T asking him to come down to Tuskegee. And so he gives up his promising career. I mean, his professor is James Wilson, who goes on to become U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. And another professor was Henry Wallace, who went on to become U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. And one of his students was Henry Wallace, the son, who went on to become U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and Vice President for Franklin Roosevelt. So here's George Washington Carver rubbing shoulders with the top people in the country. And he gets a letter from Booker T saying, I can't offer you money, position, or fame. The first two you have, and the last from the place you know occupy, you'll no doubt achieve. These things I ask you to give up. And in their place, I offer you work, hard work, but the knowledge of bringing people from degradation, poverty, and waste to full manhood. Signed, Booker T. Washington. George Washington Carver writes back and he says, I look forward to joining you in doing all I can through Christ who strengtheneth me to better the condition of our. So that was the first book I read. And we later, I published a book giving the story. I read through all of George Washington Carver's personal correspondence. So most of the history books would say Carver, called his laboratory God's little workshop and sort of made it sort of cutesy. Well, I read through his correspondence and he was very deep. He talked about how they were going to pass different bills in Congress, and he was asked by the Peanut Growers Association to go up to Washington, D.C., because he came up with all these uses for the peanut. And so he comes in, they give him a few minutes to talk, but he fascinates them. He pulls out of his bag how he can turn peanuts into milk and turn peanuts into mock beef and like he did the same thing with soybeans, like, soy burgers, and how he was able to turn it into food. And the different congressmen would say, well, we don't want it if it's going to compete with the beef industry or compete with the dairy industry. And he assured them it would be okay. And then the head of the committee said, Dr. Carver, how did you learn all these things? He said, from an old book. What old book? He said, the Bible. He says, does the Bible tell about peanut? No, sir, it tells about the God who made the peanut. I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did. Anyway, I felt quotes from George Washington Carver in this book. And then because he taught at Tuskegee, I would always be fascinated with Booker T. And the more I read, I thought he's an unsung hero. He was the first black to become a president of a university. He, after the Civil War, his mom and his stepdad moved to West Virginia. And then his dad wouldn't let him go to school because he needed to work. And he worked for jobs. And he begged his stepdad to let him go. And the dad says, okay, but you can't quit your job. So he would wake up at 4 a.m, go work in a salt furnace where you have a spring that comes up from the ground. But if it comes up through a salt deposit, and in wintertime, the little pond doesn't freeze. And so they would take that water and boil off the water and have salt crystals, and then they would sell it and then later turn it into a mine. So he worked there. And he said one time, and I hate to admit it because it wasn't right, but I so much wanted to go to school, and I'd always show up at school late, that I turned the hand on the clock forward so that I could work early so I could rush and get to school. And he says, when they finally caught on, they put the clock in a box that nobody and locked it. So,
and he actually taught himself how to read, right, while he was working in those mines. Is that right?
Yeah, he would study and
yeah.
And then after work he would work 2 jobs, and the one time he said that he felt so bad because he worked the second job and he came home and he took a nap and then all of a sudden his brother found him and shook him and he said, Mom died. And he said that it was sad that he hadn't been there, and he said that everything I am is because of my mom. And his mom the mom couldn't read at all, but the mom would encourage him to school. And then he walks and hitches rides on trains and everything, and he goes 500 miles all by himself to Hampton Institute in Virginia, and which was started by a Union general. Matter of fact, all of the historical black colleges were founded by Union Republican white men generals who they call them the Freemen's Institute, the Freeman's Bureau. And so this was the Union commander Samuel Chapman Armstrong, and he had actually was born in Hawaii, the son of a missionary. And so he started this Hampton Institute, and Booker T. Washington went there, got a job as a janitor to pay for his schooling. Afterwards, he goes to the Wayland Bible Seminary in Washington, D.C., and then he goes back to West Virginia, and he's working 2 or 3 jobs, but he's teaching a Sunday school class at an African Methodist, church, and he meets his first wife there. Unfortunately, she had died after he started Tuskegee, and then he married again, and she died, and then he married a third time. And then he went back to Tuskegee to give a speech, and they liked him so much they hired him. And then when they wanted to start another Freeman's Bureau school in Alabama, they were looking for somebody to be the president, and Samuel Chapman Armstrong recommended Booker T. Says, here's a black man, he's the perfect one. And so he goes down there, and there is no school. He just meets in another African Methodist Episcopal church, and then he gets an engineer from MIT, like he got George Washington Carver from Iowa State, and he designed buildings. They bake the bricks on the site and buildings, and they built a beautiful chapel there, and so this idea of that he had was to work hard, and so the happiest people are those who do the most for others. The most miserable are those who do the least. And then he said, we must learn to incorporate God's laws into our thoughts and words and acts. Frequent reference is made in the Bible to the freedom that comes from being a Christian. And then Booker T said, remember that the only way to show ourselves superior to others is to excel them in kindlier impulses and more generous deeds. He said, I will permit no man to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him. And so this is such a contrast to the cancel culture that I'm going to make your kids pay, and I'm going to make you pay, right? When it's unforgiveness. And the sad thing is if you don't, you'll be forgiven to the same extent that you forgive others. And then he read the Bible all the time, and he credits.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk about that and his faith, because it was such an influential part of his life. So just tell us how that was really incorporated. And I know in your book he said, I find that a day rarely, if ever, passes when I'm at home that I do not read my Bible. So just tell us how his faith really impacted all the many things that he did.
So when he was going to the Hampton Institute, one of his teachers was a lady, and she was the one who encouraged him to read the Bible every day. And so he got into the habit of doing that. And he kept that habit up throughout his entire life. So he said, well, one of the other things, so I quote from him in my book. He goes, a valuable lesson I learned at Hampton Institute was to use the bath. I learned there for the first time the value of not only keeping the body healthy, but inspiring self-respect. In all my travels in the South and elsewhere after leaving Hampton Institute, I always, in some way, sought to take a daily bath. To get it, sometimes when I had been a guest at somebody's single-room cabin, he would wake up early and slip away into some stream in the woods and then take the bath. But he said the reading the Bible became this habit, and it allowed him to continue to have that deep spiritual strength throughout his whole life. And so this is what he writes in his book, Up From Slavery, in 1901. Perhaps the most valuable thing I got out of my second year at Hampton Institute was an understanding of the use and value of the Bible. Miss Natalie Lord, one of the teachers from Portland, Maine, taught me how to use and love the Bible. I learned to love to read the Bible, not only for a spiritual help which it gives, but on account of it as literature. The lessons taught me in this respect took such a hold upon me that at the present time, when I am at home, no matter how busy I am, I always make it a rule to read a chapter or a portion of a chapter in the morning before beginning the work of the day. Whatever ability I may have as a public speaker, I owe in a measure to Miss Lord. And so he even gave an address called the Role of the Bible in the Uplifting of the Black Man. And he talks about how it teaches you hard work, that the lazy man turns on a bed like a door on its hinges. The one guy gets the 5 talents and multiplies them, and the 2 talents multiplies. One person buried it. He wrote in The Story of My Life and Work, aside from General Armstrong, Marshall, and Miss Mackey, the persons who made the deepest impression on me were Miss Natalie Lord and Miss Elizabeth Brewer, 2 teachers from New England. I am especially indebted to these 2 for being helped in my spiritual life and led to love and understand the Bible. Largely by reason of their teachings, I find that a day rarely passes, if ever passes, when I'm at home. I do not read the Bible. And so just a very encouraging story, but he would always talk about lifting up people. And he said, I want my graduates to not just be tolerated, but to be wanted, to be needed. I want them to make themselves useful by helping other people. And contrast that to the other thought that basically goes back to somebody named W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was an elitist that went to Harvard. And then he went over to Germany and praised the socialists. And then he went over to the Soviet Union 4 times and praised Stalin. And then he went over to China and praised Mao Zedong. And W.E.B. Du Bois is the one that came up with the idea of reparations. And he criticized Booker T's attitude of working hard and helping others. And W.E.B. Du Bois eventually he converted and became a communist and joined the U.S. Communist Party. Then he rejected American citizenship, went over to Ghana where he died. But yet W.E.B. Du Bois' teaching and philosophy of demanding reparations infiltrated academia. But even during their lifetime, you would have W.E.B. Du Bois criticizing Booker T. Now, Booker T basically said that the freed blacks need to follow the pattern of every wave of immigrants. So you would have a wave of Jewish immigrants and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants. And first they would come over and be treated really bad. And they would be on the bottom of the social spectrum, the ladder. But they would work hard, pool their money, and they would eventually get money to buy a business and buy a farm. And as they got money, they would get successful. And Booker T. Washington said, this is the pattern. And he created a Negro Business League. And he said, let's buy from our own selves. Let's pool some money. And he actually got an honorary doctorate from Harvard. And the Harvard president said that Tuskegee Institute has produced more millionaires than Harvard has. It's like, whoa. And so this was the attitude until LBJ's Great Society Welfare State came in and pulled the rug out from under it.
So it's so knowledgeable. There's so much stuff that's going on. I'm trying to pull out a nugget here because the more you learn about him, it's like what drove him. Because the guy went through a lot. He was born into slavery, but he never ever played the victim.
Yeah.
It seems like he rose above all that to change it. What can we learn? If you had one thing for young people to say, look, you need to know about Booker T because this. I love the work ethic. It's almost like that's gone. And the victim thing is like, it's not my fault. I'm entitled and I don't work anymore. Give me. But there's such a power in reading somebody's, story, especially someone like that it has to be inspiring. I'm hoping to lots and lots of people. So what is the one thing after all your research you can go, I tell you about this guy. The one thing you need to know about him and learn about him is this.
Yeah, because Bub too, I think it's so countercultural to even,
Absolutely.
it was then, and it is even more so, I think, now. I mean, you have ancestors of slaves suing universities for $70 billion. Right? It's just so countercultural that he really thought, no, if you want something in life, you need to work hard for it.
Yeah, even George Washington Carver, he worked jobs. He would started a laundry when he lived in Minneapolis, Kansas, and he would say things like, "I never allowed anyone to give me money. No difference how badly I needed it." I wanted literally to earn my own living. It's like, wow. And so Booker T. Washington said, nothing ever comes to me that is worth having except as a result of hard work. He said, what we should do in all our schools is to turn out fewer job seekers and more job makers. Anyone can seek a job, but it requires a person of rare ability to create a job. And then he says, leaders have devoted themselves to politics, little knowing, it seems, that political independence disappears without economic independence, that economic independence is the foundation for political independence. He says, I want to see you own land. And he says, the Negro has the right to study law, but success will come to a race sooner if it produces intelligent, thrifty farmers, mechanics to support the lawyers. And then he said, no man who continues to add something to the material, intellectual, and moral well-being of the place in which he lives is left long without proper reward. And then he quotes from the Bible. He said, be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man soweth, that he shall reap. And again, what sparingly shall reap sparingly, that soweth bountifully shall reap bountifully. And so he gives applications throughout his life. And but the one line, if I were to pick the quote, is he says, the best way to lift yourself up is to lift up somebody else.
Well, talk about, I mean, we can do a whole show on that. That's a powerful statement right there, and I think something we all need to learn. And we were just talking earlier that out of that school, the 84% of them went on to be doctors, lawyers, or all the other trades that you talked about. It seems like that's not what school's producing anymore. At least in large, that's not what's going on in the education system. What was it that made that so powerful? Is it just because they lived it out and they had a leader that did what he said? I mean, why is it such a why were the results so astoundingly great?
Yeah, there was no self-pity in Booker T. Washington's personality. And I have a number of his quotes here, and he said this so often, but they're all worth repeating. The surest way to lift up yourself is to lift up somebody else. If you want to lift yourself up, lift up somebody else. There are two ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, the other is pulling up. A race, like an individual, lifts itself up by lifting others up. There is no escape. Man drags man down, or man lifts man up. You can't hold man down without staying down with him. And then he says, the happiest people are those who do the most for others. The most miserable are those who do the least. And then he said, keep in mind that service to our fellows will always be our greatest protection and will bring the greatest happiness. And then again, the only way to show ourselves superior to others is to excel them in kindlier impulses and more generous deeds. What a tremendous attitude toward life for people of any race. And so now he was down in the South, and the South had Democrats, and the Democrats, you had some that supported him and some that didn't like it. When he got the president, William McKinley, the 25th president, Booker T. Washington talked him into coming to Tuskegee. Here, this little school, and here comes the president of the United States. And so, and then the next president was Teddy Roosevelt. And then the next president was Taft. And so for 30 years, some of the history books call it the age of Booker T. Washington. For 30 years, was always involved in Washington, D.C., and this attitude of helping people. The one interview that was done on the street was the one person mentioned his Atlanta exposition. And so this was a big deal. So you had these World's Fair and, 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, but you had a Chicago World Exposition, but then there was one in Atlanta, and the crowd was huge, and it had international attention on it, and he gives his speech, and he had two groups. There were the people in the area that were eyeing him, wanting to see if he was going to get uppity, and then they would have a negative response, which would have been even worse. But then there were his own people that were looking at him and saying, please plead our case. And so he gives this famous speech. And this is September 18th, 1895, at the Atlanta International Exposition. He says, a ship lost at sea for many days, of course, coming across the equator, suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. And the mast of the unfortunate vessel sent a signal, water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel came back, cast down your bucket where you are. And of course, this was in the middle of the ocean. You don't want to do that. Now, I'll finish that, but I wanted to give a little bit of what Booker T. Washington wrote about it. He says, Atlanta was literally packed at the time, people from all parts of the country with representatives of foreign governments, as well as military and civic organizations. The afternoon papers had forecast the next day's proceeding in flaring headlines. All this tended to add to my burden. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning, before day, I went carefully over what I planned to say. I also kneeled down and asked God to bless my effort. Right here, perhaps I ought to add that I make it a rule never to go before an audience on any occasion without asking the blessing of God on what I want to say. And then he goes back to his story. The second time, water, water, send us water, ran up the distressed vessel. The answer came back, cast down your bucket where you are. A third and a fourth time, cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel, at last, heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh water, sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. So the Amazon River is the longest river in the world, over 4,000 miles, and it discharges fresh water close to 100 miles out into the ocean. And so here, the ship didn't know that it was in this path of the fresh water coming out, and when it heated. And so then he finishes his address. He goes, to those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate importance of cultivating friendly relations with a southern white man who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. To those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits of prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I said to my own race. Cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down among the 8 million of Negroes whose habits you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested. Casting down your bucket among my people, helping and encouraging them as you are doing on these grounds, and with education and heart, you will find that they will buy your surplus land, make blossom the waste places in your fields, and run your factories. While doing this, you can be sure in the future, as in the past, that you and your family will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, and law-abiding and unresentful people that the world has seen. Anyway, he goes on a powerful speech.
Yeah.
Follow God, don't have self-pity, and lift others up. There it is.
Yeah, I think those are the takeaways. Well, we're gonna wrap up. Bill, thank you so much for being on the show. I wanted to highlight a couple things. One, his book here that you can find. You can find it either on his website, which is AmericanMinute.com, and Bill has written other books on all sorts of different topics, part of history and different people. You can also find this book on Amazon or on his website. And so we just want to thank you again so much for coming on the show and being willing to tell us about Booker T. It truly sounds like he was a man of God who believed in first putting God first and then working hard. And you weren't gonna go anywhere if you didn't work hard. And so great lessons.
Still true today. I'm going to throw a fun footnote here. Bill did a PragerU video. He did a PragerU.com on Christmas, and it's a fascinating brief history on the story of Christmas. And so we worked on that together. I just wanted to throw that at PragerU.com and look up William Federer, and you can find that video. It's very, very fun, good for the kids, good for the family. and good for the heart. So I leave you with that. More resources from Mr. Federer.
That's awesome. Bill, before we close, just any final thoughts you want to leave us about Booker T or anything else that you think our audience would like to hear today?
Yeah, well, just the generosity that he had, the hard work, the determination, and the role of the Bible. And then, so Booker T wrote, as a rule, a person should get into the habit of reading his Bible. You never read in history of a great man whose influence has been lasting who has not been a reader of the Bible. Take Abraham Lincoln, Gladstone, who was there in England. Their lives show that they have been readers of the Bible. If you wish to properly direct your mind and necessarily your lives, begin by reading the book of all books. Read your Bible every day and you will find how healthy you will grow. So just great inspiration from somebody who had been a slave and pulled himself up to become the first black president of a university, to be the first black man to have dinner in the White House, to be friends with several presidents from William McKinley to Teddy Roosevelt to William Howard Taft. And then he actually went over to England and he had lunch with Queen Victoria. And so he literally went from slavery to being an internationally renowned person. And his attitude of the best way to lift yourself up is to lift up somebody else.
Love it. Attitude of gratitude.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Love it. Yes, thank you so much. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have not yet done it, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We'd love to have you join us for more episodes of DeBunked Files. And just to talk a little bit about our next episode, we're going to leave it up in the air. We have some things in the works. It might be a really cool interview. And so we're waiting to see if it comes through. So I'm going to say you're just going to have to watch for details. And we hope to see you soon.
Like 'em.
Exactly. Bob, thanks for joining me today as well. Mr. Federer, thank you so much for joining us again. And we're going to end this video. Go ahead.
Candace and Bub, thank you for having me on.
Sure. We're going to end this video like we do every video because it was the most important thing in Booker T. Washington's life. It's the most important thing in our lives, and that is the gospel. So thanks for joining us, everybody, today. Adios.
Buckle up, because this is the most important thing you'll ever hear, straight from the pages of the inerrant, infallible Word of God. The Bible teaches that God created everything, and He called His creation very good. He created man in His image. Then He made woman from the man, and man named her Eve. God gave them dominion over all creation, and He also gave them free choice. Man and woman were in perfect paradise, naked and unashamed, with only one restriction. They were commanded not to eat from a certain tree in a garden where God had placed them. God warned them that if they disobeyed Him, it would be sin, and death would follow. Now, being tempted by Satan through a serpent, Eve ate from the forbidden tree, then gave the fruit to the man, and he ate it too. Thus, mankind had sinned against God. Now, a holy God must deal justly with sin, so He did. Because man had dominion over all God created, the entire universe was cursed, and we all now live in a corrupt and fallen world full of death, suffering, pain, evil, tears, and toil. The sin nature had entered reality, and since then we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and the consequences are terrifying. Dead in our trespasses, we are all doomed to eternal destruction, away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His might, and there's nothing you or I can do to save ourselves. That's fantastic news, isn't it? No, it's not. It's the worst news ever. But here's the good news. Here's the gospel. God loves us so much that He sent His one and only Son to rescue us, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, fully God and fully man. Born of a virgin, conceived by the Holy Spirit, Jesus lived a perfect and sinless life, which makes Him uniquely qualified to pay for our sins and rescue us from God's wrath. Not only did He step down into humanity, but He was executed on a cross in our place. He was pierced for our sins and crushed for our rebellion. Upon Him is our punishment, and by His wounds we are healed. Amazing love, amazing grace. But that's not all. Jesus, after being placed in a tomb for 3 days, resurrected, thus conquering the last enemy, death. So powerful is the work and name of Jesus that whoever believes in Him will not perish but have eternal life. So wonderful is his mercy and grace that all who call upon his name, confess with their mouths, and believe in their hearts that he was raised from the dead, shall be saved. And the one who Jesus saves is no longer condemned, but is completely set free, and will dwell in the unimaginable new heavens and new earth with Jesus and his co-heirs forever. There will be no more pain, no more sin, no more suffering, no more death, no more evil, and no more tears or toil, for Christ himself will make all things new. This is the full gospel, and like I said, the most important thing you'll ever